going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. As promised, this week I am going to be talking about the engine and the 1973 Camaro Z28. So before I dive into the actual plan and what I have ordered, what I have in stock of this engine build, let me just talk about what has happened so far leading up to this point, in case any of you guys that are just tuning in are new. So back in when I first got this car and decided to pull the engine, probably about 4-ish months ago, I would say, maybe 5 months ago now. The engine was fine, the block checked out fine, had the machine shop go through it, hot tank it, magnaflux the block, check everything out, and everything was good. It was a numbers matching block for the 73 Camaro, so the number on the pad, the engine block matched to the car, so I definitely want to keep this engine. Original plan was just to rebuild it and put in a little bit of a mild cam, change heads, but I found out after magnafluxing everything that the machine shop found 2 cracks in the crankshaft of this car. What that means is I told them to stop everything that they were doing and just give me back what they had and let me decide what I want to do. And when I decided what I wanted to do was build this stock block and start a 383 stroker build. So I then ordered the rotating assembly from Skip White Performance, and that was on back order. The pistons were on back order for 3.5 months until I was finally able to just get that in now. That's everything, real just quick in a nutshell, going over everything of what happened leading up to why I'm building a 383 stroker on a factory block instead of just rebuilding the internal components. Now, I also want to tell you that there's no work in this video. I'm just strictly going over the engine build plans to answer everyone's question that is curious about the engine build, what I'm doing, what cam I'm getting, what rotating assembly, what pistons that I went with, all that's covered in this video. So if you don't like a lot of talking, I apologize. There's no work this week that is actually being accomplished. I just wanted to give a solid foundation of everything that I wanted to talk about with this build, and then I can go ahead and start building the engine whenever I get in the rest of the parts. So let's get started now. Let's go down to my basement and where the rotating assembly is, and let's start talking about that. So excuse the mess down here, but I'm downstairs in my basement. I'm going to be talking about the rotating assembly and the plans down here of what I've been waiting for the past 3.5 months from Skip White. I also got a MagnaFlow exhaust that I've had for the past couple months here. I went with their X-Pipe system for the Camaro, and it is 2.5 inches. But let's dive deeper into what we got here. So this is what was sent from Skip White. And as I mentioned before, if I could keep this box open, the pistons were the reason why this took so long, because they were on back order. Now I was being picky and I wanted at least a 10cc dished piston, and I ended up getting a 12cc dished piston, which is fine. I just didn't want to go any like a 7.5 or flat tops, because that's just going to be way too much compression that I need for the street, or I don't need for the street to run pump gas. There was a little bit of miscommunication between the company Skip White Performance and myself. I was thinking I was getting an internally balanced assembly, and I got everything and took out the harmonic balancer and saw weight on it, and then I thought they sent me the wrong harmonic balancer. Looked at the flywheel, it said externally balanced flywheel, saw everything was drilled out, so I knew everything was externally balanced. For the 5.7 rod that I went with, 5.7 inch length rod, we would have to go to a forged crankshaft for whatever reason to be an internally balanced, and that was another $600 more, and I wasn't going to see the power beyond 500 horsepower of the crank that I would need a forged crankshaft. So I decided to stick with this whole assembly, and I know it's balanced out correctly. So a lot of 383 strokers are still externally balanced. I feel like that's more common than internally balanced, especially with a 5.7 rod, apparently. So that's that story there. A little bit of miscommunication between them, but overall I'm happy. The shipping, they overnighted this to me, and as soon as they got the pistons in, they balanced it within a week, overnighted it to me, and nothing was damaged. So that was nice on that end. Came in 2 different boxes. I have the dampener, all the bearings that came, and of course the rings, the flywheel, sheet that has everything balanced, and bob weight card. Let's see what this looks like here. So So you can see that. I'm not too sure really how to read these things. I just know that everything was supposed to be balanced together. That includes anywhere from the rings to even the clips for these pistons to hold it on to the rod. Everything was balanced to within a total weight of 2 grams, I think it was, or maybe it was even less than that total. And everything looks pretty nice. So that is the Bob White card, but it's 30 over. They say negative 12 cc's, meaning a dished piston. I went with the 5.7 rods. It's an externally balanced rotating assembly. What that means, you have to have a externally balanced dampener as well as an externally balanced flywheel. Let me pull that out. Here's the flywheel. Now what externally balanced means again is there's a weight here which they put on either side, and once they spin the whole assembly, the crankshaft with the harmonic balancer and with the flywheel together, they can come to hopefully what's known as a neutral balance, meaning everything is balanced out, and then your assembly is balanced at that point. For an externally balanced crankshaft, they can either add weights or subtract weights on the harmonic balancer, or this flywheel, from my understanding, is able to be drilled in and removed weight just by drilling in and removing material from the outside edge. So that's what they look like they did here. This is a billet flywheel from Ram Clutches, or Ram, I think. Yeah, Ram. I upgraded that as well instead of the normal. It's supposed to be a little bit stronger. But anyway, that is an externally balanced flywheel, so then that they can just drill out weight as they need to on that. They didn't add any weight, so that's good. They only removed weight. Now the crankshaft, on the other hand, this is what this looks like here. They removed a bunch of material from the bob weights of this externally balanced crankshaft, so that's actually good because I'd rather them removed. If you think about it, it's kind of like, in my opinion, a mix of, even though they call it an externally balanced assembly, I think it's a mix of both because they are taking material out from this crankshaft still, as well as the flywheel. So my only other question for them, which I have to get in touch with them, is to make sure that they put, when they balance this, they do hundreds of these assemblies, so I'm sure they did, and all the videos I watched of them balancing it online, they always have that sprocket that goes on the front of the crankshaft to connect the timing chain. That should have been on there too, so I just want to make sure and verify they threw some sort of generic weighted crankshaft gear on there, so that was hopefully balanced like that too. But I'm sure they did. I'm just being kind of overcritical and analytical on things just because I waited so long to get this in. I don't want anything to go wrong with this. Let's look at the pistons now. Now, like I was saying, these are the 12cc dish pistons. They come with these little rings which were actually balanced together too. On the bob weight card, they included this weight as well as the wrist pins. Those are of course included on there. Now these pistons have the weights on them here on the bottom. Let me take one out. So these are really nice 12cc dish pistons. This is to keep the quench within the right spec, hopefully, and not have a super high compression ratio, which I will talk about here later on in the video. These are forged pistons, so these will outlast the crankshaft if you want to throw more power at it, which again, my goal is to be around 500 horsepower at the crankshaft with this whole unit. Now let's talk about the rods. Again, I did the competition rod upgrade. Did clearancing on the big end of the rod, making sure everything was sized appropriately. And these rods are supposed to be stronger too, and they have the upgraded rod bolts as well. So pretty nice looking. And you could see, I told them what cam I was running. Here it is. So they took off right there at the end where potentially it could come into a clearancing effect of the camshaft that I'm going to be running. So as it swings around, the camshaft might be coming into contact with this. So they run this cam all the time, which I will talk about shortly. But the one I went with, they knew exactly where to clearance everything because they built so many engines. Then they line everything up all together and shave off this right here, this portion, to make sure everything is clearanced well. So nicely packaged. Glad I went with that upgrade on that. Let's hop onto the computer right now, and then I'll talk about compression ratio and the camshaft spec that I went to. The camshaft is now on. I wanted to wait for this before I ordered the cam because I didn't want to take any chances in case for some reason they cancel my order on this. And then now the camshaft is on back order, but that should be hopefully within the next week and a half that I'll get that in. So I'm waiting on the camshaft now. Okay, so just to go over some of these upgrades again. The first one I did was the rod to cam clearancing and sizing upgrade. And what this means is you can see here that they resize the rods on the big end right out of the box just because it might not be completely correct and the sizing might be a little bit off on brand new rods. And the most important thing that is included on this is I do know what cam that I'm going to be running, so I told them that. And they put these all on the machine. They shave down part of the rod all in one section, so it does clear the cam that I'm running. Our next upgrade I was talking about the race balancing, but it is within 0.2 of a gram or less is what the whole assembly is balanced to. So what this does is create a super smooth RPM range. Now the third and final upgrade that I did was this SCAT competition rod upgrade. This rod has better clearancing for the block, and you won't need to take out as much material when the machine shop comes time to clearancing the block. They also come with these larger 7/16 cap screws, and they are rated at a higher horsepower rating of at least 600 horsepower as well. They're definitely a worthwhile upgrade. If something's going to fail, it's going to be either your rod bolts or your rod. So definitely wanted to upgrade that. Here is my camshaft that I ordered, just giving you a little bit more spec on it. This is the Howard's Cam CL110 24510. It has an advertised duration of 278 intake, 284 exhaust, and the lift is 0.5 intake and 0.510 exhaust. I know I could have got a lot more lift out of that. It does have 110 lobe separation as well, just a note. But anyway, I know I could have got a lot more hairier on the camshaft, but again, this is usable power. I don't want to have to wait 5,000 RPM until everything starts to work together well. I want to have it instant. Whenever I put the pedal down, I want everything to be ready to go. So this has an operating range stating from 1600 to 5400 RPM. The factory tack on the 73 Camaro I think goes up to 55, so that's perfect for the operating range. It matches what the stock tack is going to be for the power band. And this also, you don't have to run a ton of compression with this. You can go all the way down to 9.5 to 1. This is extends valve train life because the lift isn't too crazy. I won't have to worry about breaking in this cam either. I was worried about wiping a cam lobe due to the variances and the low zinc content in the oil of today's oils. So well, I'm going to be running zinc additive and everything when I run this engine, obviously, but that's one less variable that could possibly take out an engine on initial startup, and I don't have to worry about wiping a cam lobe with this. So this is on Skip White's website here. Now, what they had here is 7.5 cc dished pistons, and they made 498 horsepower and 484 foot-pounds of torque, but this is with their heads. Their heads are decent, but I'm going to be using a better set of AFR heads, which I will talk here in a second. So I would expect my engine to be at least around this range as well for that. So that's where I'm getting my figures from. And this one is going to have a little bit higher of a compression ratio, but for my heads, I think it'll be around the same, if not a little bit more horsepower. So what's important about this is that this power, although the peak power might not be that crazy and the peak torque might not be that crazy, the average power across the whole power band is pretty nice here. So that's what I was looking for. I wasn't going for peak numbers, although it is nice to say you have that high horsepower figure, but I think this is a very good usable torque and horsepower combination using this cam. I am going with a Edelbrock intake manifold, and it's going to be a dual plane intake manifold. I'm not going with the single plane as used in this graph here, so that might be a little bit different here. This is a single plane intake used on this, and I am going to be using a 750 carb, but I think this is going to be a very comparable, especially with using these AFR heads, which are going to be AFR 195 intake runners with the 65cc combustion chambers, and I think this is going to be a very good torquey setting to match with my cam and everything else that I'm building with this. I still have to order these heads, but I just want to make sure the machine shop, I have to have a couple different areas to have him measure to determine compression ratio, and I just don't want to have a too crazy of compression ratio. So I'm waiting on these heads once I take this engine to the machine shop, which of course I have to wait for the camshaft because I want him to make sure the clearance of the rods, I want him to double check Skip White's measurements for that. Let's go over some compression ratio. This is a static compression ratio that I'm going to be calculating here. This takes in a lot of different factors that you need to calculate to be more accurate for static compression ratio. So of course you have your bore size of 4.03 for 30 over. The stroke for a stroker is 3.75. Rod length I'm using is 5.7 inches. A head gasket, it takes into account the additional space between the bore and the head gasket bore, so it's 4.166, and that can actually affect your compression ratio calculation as well. The compressed head gasket thickness is going to be 0.039, and these two numbers here are just found on your actual, wherever you're ordering, like Summit or whatever. They have everything number-wise already calculated for you for that. So just look up your spec sheet on what head gasket you're going to run and then plug it into this calculator. The block deck height, I just used the standard for this. This might change a little bit, but it's not going to affect the compression ratio with the variance that I think it may or may not have. So I just put in the 9.025 standard difference for the block deck height. And this also calculates the compression ratio using the top of the first ring to where the top of the piston is flat. That little gap actually creates a variance in compression ratio as well. So I measured it and it is 0.25 inches. The cylinder heads that I'm using, as I've talked about already, I am using the AFR 195 with the 65cc combustion chambers. I have a 12cc dish, and this is one of the factors that I have to have the machine shop check, but the piston to deck height is, I'm thinking it's going to be 0. It might be in the hole a little bit. I hope it's going to be at 0 deck, and that actually has a big difference if you change this number. So anyway, I put it for 0 for right now until the machine shop checks the block with the whole rotating assembly. Once I get everything in and drop that off to them, and then I can change this number accordingly. Now, I know a lot of you are probably going to say, be careful of the stamping on if he does have to, correct the top of the block and flatten that out. Most of machine shops, they just wipe the whole thing, and that will wipe the pad out because this is a numbers matching block. I don't want that to happen, and that will just basically mess the whole build up and decrease the value of the car. So I made note of that, make sure I am going to be telling this guy everything I need to want him to look at, and which I'll show you actually what I typed out here too. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So I plug all these numbers in here, and we come to a compression ratio. I'm thinking it's going to be around 10 to 1. So this is 10.04 to 1 static, and that is from everything that I've been looking up, running 93 octane. As long as I don't go too crazy with timing, that should be completely fine, as well as having aluminum heads is going to help prevent any detonation to the engine. And then this last thing, which I have to wait, is something called dynamic compression. I don't really know too much about this to really explain the dynamic compression, but you want to be around 8.5 to 1, and that's with aluminum cylinder heads. So you could have a really high static compression ratio, say like as they're explaining here, of 11 to 1, but then depending on your cam, depending on the duration of the cam, that can bleed off some pressure and your dynamic compression can change. So what you want to be safe, depending on the cam that you're running, you want to be around 8.5 to 1 with aluminum cylinder heads. And that just reiterates the fact that I can run pump gas on this. So my last and final check that I have to do, I plugged everything in here: cylinder bore, stroke, cylinder head, 65cc combustion chambers, head gasket, the deck clearance. Let's put that for 0 right here. Connecting rod length of 5.75 or 5.7. I'm sorry, connecting rod length, And then this intake valve closing point. I can't find this on my cam spec sheet anywhere, just from Summit, so I'm going to have to wait for the cam card to come in. So once I plug this in, I could then hit calculate and then hope that this value is anywhere from 8.5 to 1 and under. And then that means that I can go ahead and order the 65cc combustion chamber AFR heads for sure and be safe with running 93 octane pump gas. Okay, so let's see. So these are the questions I have for my machine shop, just to kind of go over what I'm thinking, is going to happen when I drop this off. You know how you get there and you just forget a bunch of questions. So I first want him to verify that what he thinks of the externally balanced crank balancer and flywheel. I want to ask him about the crank sprocket question, if that will throw that measurement off, if for some reason Skip White didn't include that measurement on there. I want to have him go over the scat crankshaft to make sure that it doesn't need any polishing further from the factory. Make sure there's no rough edges in the oil galleys where the oil goes through the crankshaft. I want him to measure the rod and main cap clearance, because I'll verify this with plastic gauge, but I don't want to spend money on a depth gauge to measure the clearance and everything, as well as a special rod vise clamp, because you need to have a special vise. You can't just use a normal vise or it'll damage the rods. So I just figured I'll pay him to do that, and then I'll check all his measurements when I go to assemble the engine with plastic gauge. Even though that's frowned upon, that'll be a final check of basically the machinist. The next one, I want to make sure that we have enough piston wall clearance, meaning because forged pistons that I'm running in here, they're going to be expanding at a much larger rate compared to something like a cast piston. So we have to make sure that we then gap the piston rings correctly. I want to make sure of the proper way to grind these rings, because I've never done that before. Most importantly, I want him to clearance this factory block, because once you rotate this whole assembly over, you then have to make sure none of the rods are going to be, or the crankshaft is going to be coming in contact with the normal casting of the small block Chevy 350 block. And there's only one shot at doing this, because I don't want to do this myself. Never done this before, and it's an original block. Like I said, I don't want to mess anything up, because if I go into a water jacket or something, that means all this is done for nothing. I want to make sure that he doesn't deck the block, but I do want to make sure that the piston to deck height is in the appropriate range. Some people say no more than 0.01 inches into the hole from the top of the piston to the top of the deck. I would like to have it be around 0 just to make sure, or 0.005 just to be safe, so the piston doesn't have that much back and forth rock in the hole. I also want to have him, when he's done grinding all this, it has to be clean. I need everything hot tanked multiple times, so I told him, obviously I'm going to pay for this if he has to do it more than one time. I just don't want any metal shavings from clearancing the block in there at all, and then I'll do a final clean when I go to assemble it myself. But I need the cam bearings and freeze plugs installed, so I'll have him do that. And then I had a question about if he has to relieve the block for any double roller timing chain, so make sure there's enough clearance in that. And then there's set screws instead of the oil galley plugs that the machinist has already tapped out, so I need just to have him throw those in there. So a lot of talking going on today, but this is what goes through my mind when I'm trying to do something like this without messing it up. There's a lot to building an engine. So if you made it this far, I appreciate it, because I know this is probably a boring video and no work was being actually accomplished. But let me know what you think in the comment section below, and anything you do differently, or any concerns maybe that you might have. Just waiting on that cam, and then I'll take it to the machine shop, and like I talked about already, I will then order the heads once he verifies a couple of those questions for the compression ratio concern that I have. Next week, probably going to be tackling the wiring harness. Unless I get the cam in, maybe I'll go to the machine shop and film that, but we'll see. I'll have to play it by ear on all these parts that are on back order and when I get them in. So thanks guys, and have a good rest of your week.